Okay, it looks like we have a pretty good group here. So I think we should go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Kevin Reuther. I'm the Chief Legal Officer at MCEA, the Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. We're so happy that you're here to celebrate with us. As you know, we won a big case at the Court of Appeals on Monday, and so we're gathered here to tell you all about that. Thank you also for being a supporter of MCA. The reason that you got this invitation is because you're one of our donors. We can't do this work without you, so thanks for being here and thanks for donating. So what we have planned today, first of all, is to provide some context and background about the case that was decided on Monday. Second, we're going to delve into the details of the case. Third, we'll consider what the implications of the case are moving forward. And we definitely want to save time for your questions. So if you have a question, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, just right down there in the middle. It says Q&A. If you click on that, you can type your questions into the Q&A feature and all of us will be able to see those. I'll make sure that we reserve some time and we get to as many of them as possible. All right, so let me introduce folks. First, I want to just really thank Peg and Tom for being here with us today. Start with you, Peg Furshong. Thanks so much. Peg is the Director of Programs at CURE. CURE is Clean Up the River Environment. She's been working for CURE for about 10 years. And CURE, as an organization, has been working on these issues, water quality, but other issues in southwestern Minnesota for over 30 years, I think. Peg lives in Renville County, where the creek is that we're going to be talking about today. So thank you, Peg, for joining us and taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today.
Thanks, Kevin. Looking forward to it.
Great. And also thank you to Tom Kalahar, who's with us from Renville County as well. Tom is retired after 35 years working with the SWCD, I'm going to like blank on the name, Soil and Water Conservation District. And he's also a city council person in Olivia. Tom and Peg formed an organization called Protecting Public Waters. They are joined with others in that organization, and they're actually the client in this case. So Tom, thanks to you for taking time out and being with us today as well.
My pleasure.
And then also Elise Larson. Hi, Elise. She is one of our senior attorneys at MCEA and also leads our water work. She's been with us for a number of years now. And Elise really is the lawyer, the lead lawyer on this case. She's the one that worked up all the facts, did all the grunt work, ended up writing the briefs to the Court of Appeals and argued in front of the 3-judge panel. She did an awesome job and got an awesome result. So thanks, Elise, for joining us too.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
Sure. All right, let's start with some background and context leading up to the court case. And I'm wondering, Peg, if you can start for us just giving us a sense of what it's like on the ground. I think that there are probably some people on the webinar who have never heard of Limbo Creek before, or maybe have from some of our emails and things, but are wondering, like, what's the big deal about Limbo Creek? Where is this? Why should we care about it? So do you want to give some of that background?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. So Limbo Creek is in the Minnesota River watershed. It is one of the last actual free-flowing public waters left in Renville County. Renville County is one of the top ag producing counties in the state of Minnesota, in southwestern Minnesota. A lot of CAFO or commercial confined animal farming operations, lots of hogs, lots of turkeys, lots of corn. Lots of corn is grown out here. So it's just north of the Minnesota River, and one of the things that used to be part of the landscape was wetlands. 90% of Minnesota's native wetlands have been drained or filled over the years. And Limbo Creek, where I live, is in the Hot Creek Township, and there's some wetlands in that area that farmers are complaining about that would like to drain, reduce in size because of the water issues that we're having. And I think one of the things that is really key to know is with all of the agricultural movement on the landscape, and I want to clarify by saying my family farms as well, so we're farmers as well, but there's different kinds of farming, right? So if you're farming and you want to move water off the landscape, it's got to go somewhere. And I think that's really what got us to the point of Limbo Creek. Is there's miles and miles of tiling in Renville County, and that water has to go somewhere. And so that really puts us in positions like we are today.
And Peg, when you say tiling, can you describe that for people?
Sure. So in layman's terms, what that is like, it's at one time it used to be terracotta piping, but now it's plastic, corrugated plastic, and it's diameters of corrugated plastic that have holes in it that gets buried underneath the surface. And its purpose is to capture water and move it into the ditch and move it into the river as fast as possible, because farmers don't want water sitting on their land because it impacts their crops. And I think Tom once shared with us that it currently in Renville County, it takes less than 48 hours for any rainfall to hit the river from any part of the landscape, because it'll go into the soil. It's buried maybe 12 or 16 inches deep, if even that deep. And then it collects that water and shoots it out to the ditch. And so unfortunately, what that also does is it doesn't allow that water to percolate down through the natural landscape and purify itself naturally, and then ultimately recharge the aquifer, right? And so that's why we're having a lot of the drought issues and water issues and well issues that we're having in rural Minnesota, is that the aquifers are not being recharged naturally because of tiling. I could talk about this for a really long time, so I think that's probably enough right now about Limbo Creek. It is, a beautiful place, and where I live, I do have in our section of Hot Creek Township, Limbo Creek crosses the northwest corner of our section.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much. So Tom, based on what Peg's described, we've got all this tiling under the agricultural lands. It's leading into drainage ditches, essentially. One of these ditches, or maybe more than one, flows into a wetland that then goes into Limbo Creek, is my understanding. I'm wondering if you can talk about, give a little bit more context to that, and then the project that was proposed that led to this case.
Sure. Renville County has about 1,100 miles of dug drainage ditch, artificially dug drainage ditch. And that's what allowed us to be able to drain 95% plus of the wetlands, hundreds of thousands of wetlands that used to dot the landscape in Renville County. The Minnesota River, its elevation drops about 150 feet as you come to the bluff of the Minnesota River, which obviously allowed for the gravitational drainage of the upper watershed in a big way. And drainage has been going on in Renville County ever since the first white settler started farming the land here, is because our landscape, Renville County soils, are excessively tight clay soils. They're very wet. And when you think of prairie potholes, Renville County was probably an example of what the prairie pothole region really looked like. But it's been about 95% converted. When I first moved down here 43 years ago from Otter Tail County, I was totally amazed at the total land conversion. It was like entering into almost like entering into another planet or another country. I just couldn't believe that we could so extensively change such a landscape. There are on pulled miles and miles of tile, drainage tile, that's been installed, millions and millions of miles of tile. About 10 years ago, we were estimating that Renville County was doubling their underground tile infrastructure every 2 years. So just imagine that. And like Peg said, all that water has to go somewhere. Every drainage ditch, every tile line ends up outletting into a public waters somewhere. And in Renville County, we have pretty much blown out most of our native streams, ravines. The amount of silt that we are delivering to the Minnesota River is astonishing. And of course, the Minnesota River has had to adapt to handle all of this excessive water that we have sent its way. And so the bank erosion and the amount of sediment that is heading downstream to Lake Pepin and the Gulf of Mexico should be an embarrassment to all Minnesotans. So how did Limbo Creek not, the PWI or the wetland inventory that was done by the Department of Natural Resources back in the late 70s, early 80s was not a perfect system. There was errors made. There was
You know, Tom, if I could just interrupt you quick before we get into that, I'm wondering if I can ask Elise to describe what the county proposed to do to Limbo Creek.
Sure.
Just so that we have an understanding of the project that we ended up challenging in this case. Elise, would you do that? And then we'll go back to Tom's introduction of the PWI issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So the project that had been proposed that would impact Limbo Creek was one of these tile projects that Peg and Tom have been, or systems that Peg and Tom have been talking about. So County Ditch 77 has existed since the early 1900s as a primarily tile system. It drained approximately 970 acres of land through these underground tiles. It then outletted into about 500 feet of open ditch that outletted into a wetland complex that abuts Limbo Creek. And so the proposal that was proposed to the county was to take that 500 feet of open ditch and extend it through the wetland for several feet to the channel of Limbo Creek, and then to channelize about a mile of Limbo Creek. And the reason why you would want to do this would be you can speed up the flow of the water that's coming out of the County Ditch 77 system and move it downstream at a faster rate, which means the water isn't getting those ecological benefits that Peg was talking about in terms of the wetlands slowing down the water, allowing some of that pollution to settle out before it's entering the Limbo Creek system and eventually ending up in the Minnesota River just a couple miles downstream.
So it's sort of a two-prong impact issue. There's all of the pollutants that are in the water, but just the fact that it's increasing the amount of water is a problem in and of itself, right?
Correct.
Okay. So Tom, let me go back to you then and have you explain what you just started to explain about the PWI. So the PWI is the Public Waters Inventory. And we'll get into this a little bit more, but why don't you start to explain again what happened back in the 80s when DNR was putting together the PWI and what happened with Limbo Creek?
Right. Limbo Creek, by the way, what a odd occurrence that it was called Limbo Creek is because Limbo Creek has been in limbo since the late 70s, early 80s. What happened is that about the time that the PWI inventory was being launched by the Department of Natural Resources, there was a petition by landowners to dredge or dig a drainage ditch through the entirety of Limbo Creek, which is about 8 or 9 miles. And that petition went before the Drainage Authority. The Drainage Authority appropriated the necessary paperwork and meetings. And to make a long story short, the petition to drain Limbo Creek was rejected by the landowners themselves back in the early 80s. But in the meantime, there was pretty much expectation that this ditch system was going to get approved. And so at the same time, they were redesigning their, Renville County was redesigning their drainage maps. And so they listed Limbo Creek proper as County Ditch 145. And that was actually put on their drainage maps, their updated drainage maps about that time. And then lo and behold, the drainage system petition was turned down by the landowners. However, the designation of County Ditch 145 remained on the drainage maps, which
Okay.
added a tremendous amount of confusion for anybody looking at that drainage map. And as far as I've been retired 7 years now, and that designation was still on the drainage map upon my retirement. And it's not that nobody didn't know it was an error. A lot of people did, because there was a lot of us that told them over the years and years that, you know, this was a pretty important error and it should be corrected.
Okay.
So there's been an argument about whether or not Limbo Creek is protected waters back and forth for the last 40 years. The entire time that I was working with water and water issues and conservation issues in Renville County, this argument was going on. The county wanted to do something. The other folks would say, well, it's protected waters, and the county would say, no, it's not. We got it right here on this map. It's not.
Right.
And so that persisted until Peg, was it 2017? That we went forward to ask the Department of Natural Resources to officially stamp Limbo Creek, include it in the PWI, and Renville County is opposing that. They are still saying that it is not a public waters, even though it meets all the designation requirements that are required. And so that's why litigation, and that's why we are here today.
Yeah, great. No, thanks for that history. So just to kind of reiterate, basically, you're saying that there was an error made back when they put together the inventory. It was clear to everybody that the creek actually is a public water, what we refer to as a public water, but it didn't get on the map. And that's sort of the source of controversy. So Elise, what is the big deal about something being a public water? What do we even mean when we say, you know, we refer to the creek as a public water as opposed to a ditch, for example?
Yeah, so in Minnesota, we made a decision long ago that certain waters in the state are going to be held in trust for all people, to be able to use them for their environmental benefits, for the good of all. And over time, that definition has been broadened. And today we have quite a robust definition of those water bodies and water courses that we think need to be protected for the public good. And so we have this broad definition, and that ties to all of the our environmental statutes, or a lot of our environmental statutes. So for example, whether you need to have a permit to dig through a public water course is tied to meeting this broad definition of being a public water. Or for the what happened in this case, needing to do environmental review of a project that would damage a public water is tied to this broad definition that we as Minnesotans have, that was adopted by the legislature because Minnesotans believe that protecting public water for the public good is an important value of the citizens of our state.
And it really is broad. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot and have you define it, but it includes pretty much every water that you can think of, doesn't it?
Yeah, so the definition that we sort of got in a dispute about here is all altered and natural water courses with a drainage area greater than 2 square miles is a public water course. And so for Limbo Creek, it was a natural water course with a 14-mile watershed, which is why we said it's black and white that this meets this like very small or this very broad definition. In fact, it has quite a large watershed when you're thinking about how small of a watershed is needed to be a public water course.
And I think it's good for people to understand that it includes altered natural water courses. So even if there was a stream that, 100 years ago was straightened and turned into a ditch, that's an altered natural water course. If it's large enough to meet the definition, it's a public water.
Correct.
Yeah. So Peg, what is the importance of the public water definition and designation to your work in protecting the Minnesota River?
That's a really loaded question. So more than 50% of waterways in Minnesota are impaired or polluted. And that means they're not fishable, swimmable, drinkable, right? And we're the state of 10,000 lakes. And so I think a lot of people don't think that we have a water crisis or a water situation that merits concern, because they think that there's so much water and it's abundant that there's not a need to be concerned. So for that reason, it's really important to us to pay attention to that. I would also like to say that the public waters inventory is important because it allows us to look to the DNR to give us science, right? MPCA and DNR give us the science to make decisions about what happens throughout the whole state. And the challenging thing about water is that water doesn't respect property lines. Water's always moving. Water impacts the things that we do in Renville County impact those upstream and impact those downstream. And I think it's important ecologically, and that is our focus, but it should be important to everyone for a variety of reasons, because decisions that might be made in one part of the state for very good reasons sometimes, if there's not these environmental worksheets done or environmental assessments done, they're not going to know what's going to happen to their neighbors downstream, which ultimately impacts all taxpayers in the state of Minnesota, right? So every time the city of Henderson on the Minnesota River gets flooded out because somebody put in a new drainage project or we had a climate rain activity, it causes everybody a lot of concern and impact financially, ecologically, etc. One of the things I wanted to say earlier about protecting public waters and why it happened is there seems to be a lot of resistance in rural places in Minnesota to have someone in St. Paul telling them what they should do. I'm going to be really honest. That's about as short as an answer as I can tell you. And that's what's going on in Renville County. And so the reason why protecting public waters organized is because there are many people locally on the ground that care about this, but weren't organized to be a collective voice to stand up for the water and the land, right? Mm-hmm. And I get that people in rural places don't want people somewhere else making decisions for them, but those people in St. Paul are elected and their job is public trust. Their job is to look out for everyone, not just one person, one county, one riverway. It's to look out for everybody's interest and to use science to make those decisions. And so protecting public waters was a way for us to locally organize people to stand up and say that this is not okay, and that it's not just the people in St. Paul that have a problem with this. There are local people that also have a problem with this.
Great. That's a great segue to what I wanted to turn to, which is basically the case and kind of preparing for the case. So maybe, I mean, I don't know who to go to. All three of you could talk about this from different angles, but I'll just start with Elise to give some, the framework of what the case was about and how it developed into a legal challenge.
Yeah, so there are 3 lawsuits that have had various, or that deal with various issues about Limbo Creek, and that relates to that there have been quite a few different decisions that have been made with regard to Limbo Creek. For the purpose of this appeal, it had to do with our request that the county evaluate the environmental impacts of this extension of the CD 77 ditch into the actual channel of Limbo Creek before they approved that project. And so the state of Minnesota, in the state of Minnesota, all citizens have the right to ask for there to be an environmental review if they can get 100 other fellow citizens to say that they have concerns with the environmental impacts of a project. And so we put together a petition with 100 signatures asking that the county perform environmental review of the project because Limbo Creek was a public water. And when a project is going to impact a public water, the general rules are that you do an environmental review of that kind of project. And so we had argued to the county, this is a public water, so you just need to do this environmental review as a matter of course. The county disagreed with us on that issue. And so that was what we had appealed to the Court of Appeals. I don't know if you want to get into the other cases at a later point and if we should just stick with
Maybe,
environmental.
yeah, why don't we just stick with the one case for now? Maybe there will be questions about the others later. But so Peg and Tom, your group, the Protecting Public Waters group, was kind of formed around this request for asking for what we refer to as an EAW, an environmental assessment worksheet. And were you guys involved in getting the 100 signatures? And talk a little bit about that and just kind of working with your neighbors and informing people about it.
Well, it was a relief to all of us in order to be able to have the direction from MCEA in order to know how to get organized. You know, we had to take baby steps to help us figure out, you know, like we didn't know that we needed 100 signatures in order to be able to petition. And we contacted friends and relatives and neighbors and people that we felt were like-minded about drainage issues and that were concerned about water and water quality and water quantity. And so we had a lot of shoe leather involved with going out and obtaining those 100 signatures. And it was uplifting to know that the more we did, the more people that we realized felt the same way that we did. And it was inspiring to be able to move this thing forward with the confidence that we were not all alone in this issue. And like I said before, this would not have happened if we weren't being coached and being handed good legal advice by Elise and company at MCEA.
Great, thanks. I don't know, Peg, if you have anything you wanted to add to that.
I think that it's a complicated issue sometimes to try to explain to people, like everyday people on the ground. It's hard to quantify the things that make this critical, and especially in rural places where people worry about livelihoods, they worry about their neighbors. Agriculture is a big industry here, and so challenging agriculture in rural places is a hard thing at times. So sometimes people really care a lot, but they don't want to be public about caring, or they are worried that their neighbor's going to be upset if they say something, even though they care about it. And so it becomes a challenge to really address the issues because agriculture is such a big white elephant in the room.
Yeah.
I would just have to say.
Well, we really appreciate all the work that you guys are doing and how you're sort of putting yourself out there in that community. I think that we have a pretty good background now of what the project was about. And Lisa, I'm just wondering if you want to take us into the case now and what the court decided on Monday. What were the top line issues and how did they get resolved?
Yeah, so we had appealed to the Minnesota Court of Appeals, and we appealed a couple of issues, but the court decided the major one that we wanted them to decide, which was, is Limbo Creek a public water that needs to be protected? So the county's response to us when we had asked for this environmental statement was that because Limbo Creek didn't appear on the PWI due to the procedural processes that happened back in the 1980s, that Limbo Creek wasn't a public water, so they didn't need to do this environmental assessment worksheet. And so we went to the Court of Appeals and said, it's not the PWI that controls, it's this broad definition, and you need to apply the broad definition. And if we apply the broad definition, Limbo Creek clearly fits into this category. And the Supreme Court agreed with us that it's not this map that was created in 1985 that dictates whether you need to do environmental review. It's really the broad definition of public waters, because those are all of the waters that are set aside for protection for all Minnesotans. The county made some other arguments as well to the court that they decided to resolve. One of the arguments that was made was that because there had been, like you were talking about, Kevin, some ditching that had happened in the past that wasn't part of a drainage system. They argued that they were really just rebuilding out this old channelization that had happened. And so this project didn't really, the words are change the course, current, or cross section of Limbo Creek. So it wasn't really changing what was on the ground. And we had argued to the court that you don't look at what happened in the past, you have to look at what's on the ground today. And this is going to be a change from what's on the ground today. And the court agreed with us on that issue as well. And then the county had argued that they could do this project without a permit, and they had made several arguments around that. And the court pretty resoundingly said to the county that the DNR had told them that they needed to get a permit, and whatever their opinions were about whether they needed a permit, those were sort of overridden by the fact that DNR, who has the authority to require you to get a permit, had told them they needed to get a permit.
Yeah, we sort of skipped over that fact when we were describing the history of this becoming a case, but maybe you want to tell people just how often DNR instructed the county not to do what it did.
Yeah, so DNR had informed, I think that I actually have here. So DNR had informed them in 5 different documents its opinion that Limbo Creek was a public water, and that they needed to treat Limbo Creek as a public water. And they informed them also prior to the hearing that they couldn't approve the project without applying for a public waters work permit. So that would be the work to actually change the channel of Limbo Creek. And the county kind of tried to get the court to ignore those facts, and the court pretty resoundingly said, we will not be ignoring direct letters from the agency charged with protecting public waters, that this is in fact a public water.
Yeah. So a couple of important precedents coming out of the decision. The first that you talked about was this issue of the public waters inventory, which is the map and the list that Tom was describing earlier. And when there are errors made, and for whatever reason, a water body is not on that list, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a public water as defined by statute. And at least for purposes of doing environmental studies, public water means like what it says. It doesn't matter if the ditch or the water is on that PWI list, right?
Correct.
So Peg and Tom, I mean, what impact might that have on other cases going forward, do you think, in your work?
Well, I do believe there's 500 other miles. What is it, Elise? How
640.
How much?
640.
There's 640 other miles just like Limbo Creek throughout the state of Minnesota that are in the same kind of a limbo situation that Limbo Creek is in. So not only does it have, is it going to have a local impact in Renville County, but this is something that citizens are going to be dealing with statewide. I'm assuming that other drainage authorities, local drainage authorities, are probably going to be looking at this case and maybe deciding in their drainage decisions a little different than if we would have lost this case, or if we would have never brought this case forward. I can guarantee you right now today that if we had not moved this case forward, Limbo Creek would be ditched today. It would be done, is because basically the county had already approved the project. The next step was hiring a contractor, accepting bids. And because of the dry summer that we had, there was a immediate desire to get out there and dig this ditch while the digging was good. And it is there's no doubt in my mind that we would have a brand new drainage ditch in Renville County. But here we are with a big win, and it feels very good.
Do you agree with that, Peg, that it will affect the way that other drainage authorities or other counties review their projects going forward?
I do, and I know this is about Limbo Creek, but I think it's really important for the people viewing today to know that there are multiple projects that MCEA is working on right now, even with CURE and protecting public waters throughout the state. We saw in the last 3 years, we saw a huge surge of independent decisions being made at the local level without state oversight, from Moorhead all the way down to Mankato, southeastern Minnesota, all around the state. And so, like Tom has said numerous times, having an organization like MCEA there to collaborate with other nonprofits and local organizers, grassroots organizers, is really key, because we don't have the legal expertise to navigate these systems. And it's like whack-a-mole, like we'll push down Limbo Creek, but 3 others will pop up. And it requires diligence, it requires a lot of support. And we couldn't have done this without the legal support that we got from MCEA. And so I think it's important for people to know that there's a strong commitment to public trust here, and there's a strong commitment to protecting these public waters, not only for people today, but also for future generations. And we are the headwater state of the Mississippi River water system, right? So what we do up here has not only impacts Minnesotans, but it impacts everybody downstream. And we just can't emphasize that enough.
Great.
Well, and I would just say, MCEA couldn't do this work without the work of Peg and CURE doing the grassroots stuff on the ground, without experts like Tom, who've been, dealing with these drainage issues for decades, bringing their expertise. This really, this win was really the result of a lot of great teamwork between, groups and individuals who are passionate about protecting public water courses.
Absolutely. I'm wondering too if this will have an effect on DNR. You were describing, Peg, how it's difficult because people in rural communities don't want to be told what to do by people in St. Paul. Granted, DNR has staff throughout the state, but I think that they're perceived as being in St. Paul. And we've come across situations where DNR is maybe a little bit reluctant, or at least not going to take the position that we might take in opposition to some drainage projects that are iffy. And so I'm wondering if you guys have thoughts about whether this could embolden the agency at all, or the department.
I don't know, Tom. You might have different thoughts on that. I just think we're in a period of time in a lot of lanes where things that we would think would happen don't necessarily happen. And I just see, when things become political, I think that's what they worry, is when they take a position that is perceived as political versus nonpartisan public trust, right? That they worry that it's going to have other ramifications. And I just know that there's potential for people to, those DNR staff live in rural Minnesota too, and it's hard for them. It's really hard for them at times. And so I think we become an ally in that way, is we can become a neutral body that helps bring public opinion forward. And we certainly aren't anti-farming. We certainly aren't anti-hunting. We certainly aren't, we have members that are avid sportsmen and women. We have, I would say 50% of our constituents have some ties to agricultural industry or enterprise. And so that's not an issue for us, but we are concerned about the ecology. We're concerned about everybody playing by the same rules. We're concerned about people thinking beyond their own personal interest and thinking about the public good. And so I think that's harder to do in this day and age, I guess is my point.
Mhm.
It's hard for the agencies, and it's hard for the nonprofits, and it's hard for people like Tom, who's a city councilman. I think it's hard for everyone. And I think we just have to move through this period of time. But how we move through this time, being transparent, trying to be good listeners, trying to make sure everybody has a voice at the table is I think the most important thing. And that's what this work is about, is making sure that a few people aren't making a decision in a boardroom that impact entire watershed, that there's transparency, and that there's consistency and following procedures and accountability.
Yeah.
I would like to add, Kevin, that with my city council hat, the city of Olivia, we have a multi-million-dollar wastewater treatment plant. We have a $1.75 billion stormwater retention pond. We are looking at a multi-million-dollar reverse osmosis system, and it is simply being imposed upon us by the Clean Water Act that was passed in 1972 and the Minnesota State Legislature through the MPCA. And we were fine with that. We all like good, clean water, and we like being good neighbors. However, the rub with municipalities and industry is that the agricultural industry is absolutely ignored when it comes to regulatory clean water discharge. We meaning municipalities and the industries, are required to meet strict standards.
Mhm.
We're okay with that. But on the other hand, it just burns us because of the fact that agriculture has a pass, and they can continue to pollute our waters, even though we are trying so hard to protect them.
And yeah, exactly. So what Tom's talking about is, both under the federal law, the Clean Water Act, agricultural dischargers generally are exempted, as opposed to industrial or wastewater treatment plants and that kind of thing. It's true as well under Minnesota's law. The Minnesota Environmental Rights Act basically has a large loophole in it for farmers, for agricultural activities. So there's definitely that exemption there. Peg, you were raising sort of the political implications, and I had a question here that's related to that. So somebody asked, do you expect that there will be attempts in the legislature to overturn the DNR's interpretation of the PWI and the results of this case? Any thoughts on that from any of the three of you?
Well, it's not good.
Go ahead, Peg.
It's not going to sit well with people. I also just want to clarify one thing. I think that it's really important to distinguish the difference between a farmer and corporate agriculture, because generally farmers are not the problem, as defined as family farmers and that context, right, in size. But when you scale up the agricultural production and you're talking about corporate agriculture, that's generally what we run into with trouble. And I agree with Tom that through the Clean Water Act and MIRA, as we look at climate and the nexus of climate and agriculture and solving some of our climate issues, I think you're going to see agriculture being reformed in how they interact with the land and the water, because I don't think that we can address climate issues without some of that reform. What that looks like, I'm not sure, but I do think we should expect it. And I do think that we need it in order to be durable. When you look at the crisis around the country around water issues, I mean, Minnesota is pretty flush with water, but many of our neighbors aren't. And water is going to be a currency in not too short of a time, if it's not already. And how we manage water is going to be critical. And so I think that we need to anticipate that.
Great.
Kevin, I can comment about the legislature if that's what you were.
Sure.
We did see bills last session aimed at trying to undermine public waters protections. And so I think that at MCEA, our legislative team would certainly not be surprised if we saw similar, if not more aggressive attempts to undermine public waters law in the next legislative session.
Yeah. Great. Let me go back to the case itself, Elise, and ask you to describe what the current status is. There's also a question in the chat about, what does this mean for the Limbo project? Is it defunct? Where are we in terms of the case itself?
Yeah, so what the court ordered, it's not that the project couldn't go forward. What they've ordered is that the project can't go forward without complying with the environmental review requirement. And so there's been a remand to the county to do this environmental assessment. I would say that the landscape, however, about this project has changed a lot because of this decision, in particular, because of the court choosing to delve into issues of DNR's authority over the water, as well as interpreting that course, current, or cross-section language, because now I think it is quite likely that the county will need to get a permit from DNR. And I think it will be difficult for them to get a permit from DNR without thinking about some changes to this project. And so the project certainly isn't, I mean, what we got was an environmental review of the project as designed, but the way the court drafted or wrote the opinion really is going to have some bigger implications for the case on the side of what kind of permits they need to get in order to move forward.
And then maybe we should clarify also that the county still has the ability to seek further review. Do you want to explain that?
Yes. So in Minnesota, if you lose a case at the Minnesota Court of Appeals, you can ask the Minnesota Supreme Court to take review of the case. They have, I believe, 30 days to make that ask to the Supreme Court. If you make the ask, there's really no guarantee that the court will take the case. In fact, I can't remember what the percentage is, but they only take a pretty small percentage of the cases where they ask for review. But there certainly is, the county and the landowners have as an option to ask the Supreme Court to take the case. And if the Supreme Court did take the case, then, Peg and Tom and I will be getting amped up for an argument there.
Kevin, you asked earlier what we expect to see happening. I don't want to stir the pot, but if we look at what's happened in other cases of commissioners, going through unpopular decisions like this decision with Limbo Creek, we've seen commissioners be challenged, and we've lost a lot of good commissioners. And some of our political influences have tried to shape their outcomes by threatening various agencies. And so it definitely could make it tough for DNR, being the one that's responsible for these permits in rural places if they're declining them. But legally, they're following the statute, right? They're following what's in the law. And so they're doing their job, right? I think, but we're seeing a lot more challenges of people doing their job, whether it's the Commissioner of Health or MPCA. So I don't know what could happen, but it's certainly, if it follows what's been going on in other arenas, it could present that challenge as well.
Yeah. There are lots of questions coming in, and so we'll try to get to some of them. Some are just sort of specific questions that people have, like, for example, whether or not there are any tiles being removed in Renville County. Is there a movement afoot to get rid of any tile drainage?
Well, I can tell you the answer is absolutely. When I was working, our office was responsible of restoring several hundred wetlands in Renville County. And that was all through the Reinvest in Minnesota program and the CREP program, and programs that were offered to landowners that were attractive enough to give them an alternative to spending a bunch of money to tile out a piece of, or to drain a piece of property, or to restore it back to natural wetland and prairie conditions. And all in all, in my career, I'm guessing that we probably pretty close to 20,000 acres of restored wetland and native prairie in Renville County, along with a bunch of acres of Minnesota River floodplain. So it's not that we cannot improve or move the needle forward with water quality and water quantity issues. It's just that we have to have cooperating agencies like drainage authorities and Department of Natural Resources and the federal government in order to be able to move those kind of programs forward. We kind of deserve the landscape that we get. And believe me, the landscape of southern Minnesota, Renville County, has been paid for by the taxpayers through the last 60 years of farm programs. And farm programs are what motivates farmers. So good or bad, that's where we're at. And I think we have a excellent future to improve water quality. Is because, quite frankly, the way we're managing land right now, we could hardly get any worse when it comes to the kind of water that we are actually delivering to the Minnesota River.
Great. Elise, talk a little bit about the evidence that you tried to put together in this petition for the environmental review. There's a question referencing a microbiologist who looks like he's been doing some genetic studies on pollution tracking and tracing. And what are the opportunities for scientists or citizen scientists to get involved in putting together these kinds of petitions in the future?
Well, we're always interested in citizen scientists who want to get engaged on drainage issues because, like Peg said, drainage kind of is a whack-a-mole type issue where, I mean, you get one project done and there's 3 more that pop up that have, you know, some serious potential environmental consequences. And so if you're one of those citizen scientists, please send me an email. In terms of this case, we had 2 expert reports. One was put together by Tom about both the wetland impacts, you know, what we were going to see in terms of habitat loss, value of cleaning out the water from destroying about 6 acres of wetlands, as well as the impacts from increased flow and sediment and agricultural pollution into the system itself. So we actually had, I mean, the Court of Appeals didn't get into this, but we had developed quite a robust record on what the significant environmental effects of this project will be if it moves forward. And certainly All of that work was not for nothing, because, you know, when the county does do this environmental assessment worksheet, those are going to be all of the things that we think the county needs to be looking into and assessing with regards to the impacts of this project on both, you know, the discrete community, but also on downstream communities.
Great, thanks. There's a question about WOTUS, Waters of the United States. And people are probably aware that the Obama administration had one definition of waters of the United States, and that was reversed and severely curtailed by the Trump administration. And so now we're back into another rulemaking. And the question is just what changes at the federal level would mean for these issues, I think, going forward.
I mean, my perspective, and maybe Kevin, you have a different perspective, is the fact that the WOTUS rules have been so up in the air at the federal level is the reason why we need to be strong advocates at the state level for protecting these broad protections that we have for public water courses here in the state. Because if the federal government is not going to be clear about the need to protect broad swaths of water courses in the country, then here in Minnesota, we need to take a stand that we still think that protecting those water courses is important. And that's why we do this work. That's why our legislative team every session is advocating to ensure that we don't undermine broad protections for public water courses here in Minnesota.
Great, I totally agree. We're nearing time, so I just wanted to give Peg and Tom another opportunity to say any last words if you wanted. And yeah, well, I'll just ask you whether there's anything that you want to add before we say goodbye to everybody.
Yes, I was always told that don't come with me with a complaint unless you have a solution. And back in 2000, the Soil and Water Conservation District, Hawk Creek Watershed Project, Renville County Drainage Authority worked very hard to be able to come up with a solution to the ditch 77 or the tile system 77's problem of an inadequate outlet. We all come up with a pumping system to lift the water from the ditch 77 system and to pump it onto the floodplain of Limbo Creek, run all that water through that complex of wetlands, and we could validate the fact that we would give the county 77 farmers relief. Plus the other benefit is that we were going to monitor the water coming out of the pump system onto the wetland for what kind of egg chemicals, what kind of water quality was coming out of the tile system, and then we were going to monitor that water as it passed at the outlet into the Minnesota River, and to see what the difference was. We were turned, and we actually went to the Department of Agriculture, received a grant for our alternative drainage system for $225,000 to pay for the pumping system, and we were turned down flat by the Drainage Authority. So it's not like we're asking them to do something that there isn't an alternative to. There definitely is, and
Thanks
it's not
for sharing that.
Yeah, and so it's, we are willing to compromise and to come up with a solution that benefits everybody and not just one industry.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any last words from you, Peg?
Yeah, I just want to say that for those that tuned in today, water is a finite resource. It's a natural resource, and it doesn't have boundaries. So if you're a landowner, you might have rights as a landowner, but with rights becomes responsibilities, right? And the responsibility is to make sure that the water is as clean, if not cleaner, than when it leaves your property as it did when it came in. And so I think that that's really an important thing that we have to think about. And I just want to thank you guys for having us today and for all your work in supporting clean water for future generations in Minnesota. So thank you.
Yeah, well, we really want to thank Peg and Tom too for being with us today, but more importantly, just for the collaboration and partnership and the other folks who are part of protecting public waters as well. It's been a really good opportunity for us and pleasure to work with you all. A couple other things before we let participants go today that I wanted to mention. One is that we actually produced a really cool video on Limbo Creek a couple of years ago, and it is available on YouTube, and I think it's probably on our website as well. So Adam, if you could put a link into chat for that so that people can click on it, I think it's worth a view. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is, and you all know this because you're already donors, but you know, this work is not possible without donations. We're not charging the people that we represent in these kinds of cases. If you're a public radio listener, you know that this week is Pledge Week started. So this is my own little mini Pledge Week. And I'm inviting you to go to our website at mncenter.org, where you'll find a donate button. And if you're not already, if you become a sustaining member, it's very helpful to us. Thank you so much to the panelists, and thank you all for joining us for this webinar. We appreciate your time. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Goodbye.